Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about the theory of clubs, the provisions of public good, and other aspect. We know that actually why this whole idea of public good has been discussed since 1950s. We had already spent a lecture on that, and of course, by the by articulating what basically Samuelson placed is normally being discussed everywhere in the literature. So today what I'm going to do is actually reading two particular papers regarding one appeared in the Economica and the other one is from Econometrica in different periods. And these two papers are very important as far as my understanding regarding the formulation of club goods are concerned. The first one is actually the seminal work by James Buchanan, and the other one is by Timothy Besley and Ian Javid, and Ian Javid, pronounced in Spain, and of course, that doesn't matter. So, my idea is actually to read and talk about a thing regarding this particular aspect, and let me come to a very overview first, and then we'll discuss about the provisions in the detailed fashion. So the clubs whether one speak of any particular club of cricket, football, or your tennis clubs, or the Homo Honors Association, your residential association, or a Republican Party or a political party, like the Communist Party or Congress Party or BJP, or any local organizations like students federations of different kind, or Mahila Association, or whatever we speak about. These are all called clubs where a few people, the people are beneficiaries, and of course that is based on their membership in that sense. So the private organizations member collectively consume at least one good or services that one person that has capacity unilaterally to finance. And clubs are thus of interest to public choice scholars because they must solve the same kind of a collective action problem as government faces in the provision of public good in that sense. So, in that context, we have to understand the proposition of James Buchanan, an economic theory of clubs in Economica. So, the implied institutional setting of new classical economic theory, including theoretical welfare economics, is a regime of private property in which all goods and services is privately utilized or consumed. Only within the last 2 decades have serious attempts been made to extend the formal theoretical a structure to include communal or collective ownership consumption arrangement. So this was actually kind of an observation which was made by James Buchanan, and the pure theory of public good remains it in its fancy while he was writing about it in 1965. So that means the Samuelson's understanding is in an nascent stage to develop, and that is how he had, in fact, written about. And even in that work, Samuelson had a distinction of purely private and those that of the purely public kind of a dichotomy. And no general theory has been developed within the covers the whole spectrum of ownership consumption possibilities, ranging from pure private or recent individualized activities on the one hand to purely public collectivized activity on the other. One of the missing link here is a theory of clubs. That is why he was proposing this particular theory, the theory of cooperative membership, a theory that will include as a variable to be determined the extension of ownership consumptions right over different numbers of person in that sense. So how everyday experience reveals that there exists some most preferred or optimal membership or almost any activity in which we engage, and that this membership is varied in some relation to economic factors. That is what he the paper starts with. So the European hotels have more communally shared bathrooms than their American counterpart. Middle and low income communities, organizations, swimming, bathing facilities, and as I said in the very beginning, all kinds of clubs are in reality exist, and therefore a pure public good and a pure private good may not be actually addresses this kind of a problem, and that is to say, for any genuinely collective good defined in a Samuelson's way, a club that has an infinitely large membership is preferred to all arrangements of finite size. So while it is evident that some goods and services may be reasonably classified as purely private, even in the extreme sense, so it is clearly that few, if any, would satisfy the conditions of the extreme collectiveness. So the interesting cases are those goods and services, the consumption of which involves some publicness, and where the optimal sharing group is more than one person or family, but smaller than an infinitely large numbers, as we said in the pure public good case of Samuelson in that sense. So in that context, this is easy to basically conceptualize what it is. And an overview of this particular functioning is being made in that sense, and a characterization in that sense of club goods are actually with that of what Samuelson said. It's like a private good, but it is not purely private. That is what we are saying. But it is a public good, but not purely the pure public good kind of Samuelson. So therefore, characterization of it is important, and clubs are excludable, but not all excludable. Those who are inside the clubs cannot be excluded. So individuals who do not contribute to financing the clubs can be prevented at relatively low cost from gaining access to the benefit of club members in that sense. So club goods are congestible, basically. So although consumption is not entirely rivalrous, there is not, as in the case of the private good, a one-to-one relationship between the amount consumed by one person and the amount available for consumption by others is also important, and that is each members of the club imposes a negative externality on his counterpart in that sense. So that negative externality materializes in the form of a crowding, which basically forms a sort of a congestible situation. And the other third category characteristics of this particular one is club is divisible. Basically, one that is, once a club member has reached its optimum size, individual who want to join but has been excluded can form a new club to produce and consume the same good. Clubs can be cloned as the demand for the members warrants in that sense. So the foregoing assumptions restrict the domain of theory of clubs or the club goods to what are commonly called impure public good. A pure public good, by contrast, is neither excludable nor congestible in that sense. So optimal club sizes in that case has no upper bound. Is a very important point to be kept. And then, with this caveats in mind, the determination of optimal club size is, in theory at least, a straightforward exercise in equating cost and benefit at the margin. That is, the exercise yields three conditions that must be satisfied simultaneously for optimum club being, and a provision of condition, that is the first one, and utilization condition and a membership condition. So these conditions are essentially necessary to make a club possible, and these three conditions helps explain the prevalence of two-part pricing of club goods: fixed up front membership, that is the initiation fees defray the club's cost of capacity provisions, while per unit charge for use of the club's facility ensures optimal utilization in that sense. But in any case, the price in the club goods is disciplined by a voting with the defeat mechanism, as clubs compete for members, as Tyboot had actually pointed out, or Hirschman had pointed earlier. As long as clubs can be cloned freely and the members of the existing clubs are free to exit, the club prices will be kept in line with the cost itself. And voting whether the feed also helps overcome preference revelations problem, as individuals or themselves out among clubs in that sense. So although the exit option helps prevent clubs from charging a price that is enormously high, but still the prestige is the other preference of the clubs of a kind of, when you grade your club as some sort of a superior sort of thing, then the pricing is actually being par, or just elevated to that level. But that is not going to last longer, because some people may not be liking, and they can actually move out and form a club which is the antithetic to the existing club. That is possible, but the legitimacy of all that can be actually understood in terms of how that is going to work, and with the people. For example, the political parties getting split. The one overarching political organization had been splitted in India, and become different clubs of political interest, protecting the political interest. This is also very important because, for example, the Congress of the erstwhile, the Freedom Fighting Congress, was not equal to that of today's Congress, which has actually had a lot of splintered political organization came out from the very front itself. In the beginning, you have a league which is came out of it, and then you have a socialist league, then you have a Muslim league, and then this socialist league had actually again divided and formed like communist movement of different kinds and different garbs. For example, the Communist Party of India had again split it in 1964, and later in 1967 become very many factions of different kinds. All this actually talks about for people, and in terms of understanding and siding with the people in that political process in that sense. Again, if you take any kind of political organization of different kind, even Congress, you have a splintered groups within the Congress. You have Pradesh Congresses of the larger kind, as well as the regional local level. You have a Kerala Congress of different factions. You have all other kind of group, in fact, came out from the original Congress itself. So there is no original Congress in that sense of right now, because there are so many people who were part of the original Congress being, in fact, started different parties, which is in fact equally important to that of the original party itself. So then you can say that these are called the possibility of expanding the public, the clubs in that form in a political spectrum. At the same time, in economic spectrum also, you can have different sort of a public good, and which happens in everywhere. So that is why this particular conceptualization is again the price and the benefit and the sort of an interest which this is propagates and advocate is different between these different groups of clubs. So it is perfectly okay in that sense. And what is actually the kind of application one can speak about? See, given this situation, the theory of clubs has been brought to bear in a wide variety of institutional settings. For example, you may be having a sort of international alliance, perhaps the most intensive investigated application of the theory of club is in the realm of international alliance. While the literature on alliance has been extensively and competently reviewed elsewhere, that it is instructive to summarize the main empirical issues. First one is in the theory of alliance, the observational unit shifts from individual person to the individual country, thereby suppressing the analysis of collective action problem at the national level. consistent with the theory sovereign national state voluntary established international organizations in that context. International communist movement and national communist movement, local communist movement can be a good example. Labor movements of international, national, subnational, even the very local level can be actually found of different, basically different sort of a club. It acts as a different sort of an club of different alliance. At the same time, also you have a local, different local left organization which aligns with the larger interest of the international sentiments in that sense. So you have all kinds. Again, the local capitalist organization and the global capitalist organization can have an equal footing of alliance in that sense. So it is always possible to basically understand that these are not purely excludable or purely non-excludable. These are actually a sort of some flexibility being basically allowed within the functioning of this understanding. So that is why the proposition of Buchanan makes a very relevant point altogether. Now, if you look into the decentralization of public goods supply by budget allocation to an expenditure authority may be an administrative convenience, but it is not generally optimum. One reason is that the authority charged with the spending may fail to take account of the budgetary implications of the public good provision via tax revenue, if you look into the economic aspect of it. And that is the complementarity and the substitutability between public and private expenditure is there. So outside the first best, in which lump sum taxes are used to finance public good, such effects will need to be considered if public good supply is to be chosen optimally in that context. So there comes the provision of decentralization, and it makes sense that whether the public good can be basically decentralized. Notwithstanding, the governments do typically seems to operate in a decentralized manner with different authorities responsible for taxing and spending decisions. Moreover, many people have emphasized the virtue of the division of political economy ground, such as Musgrave's work itself. So it is interesting to know, therefore, when this is consistent with the optimizing view of government and the optimum tax tradition. Thus, we investigate a division of government of the following kind. That is, there is a revenue authority which sets taxes and budget for an expenditure authority, which is charged with the allocating its budget among public good to maximize social welfare. In doing so, it will apply the usual rule of equating the marginal rate of substitution of the social welfare function to marginal rate of transformation in a theoretical sense. This is what is actually, as I said, we will be reading Timothy Besley to understand this. This is critical point altogether. So in the following the paper, that is the expenditure the authority need only know to relatively social value of different public good, and the optimal lump sum taxation is possible, then the social cost of providing public good is fully captured by cost of their provisions, and the optimum marginal social welfare will be a set proportional to the cost of provisions. And without lump sum taxation, the purchase of public good must be financed through distortionary taxation, and changing the output mix of public good will generally alter the demand for private good and hence tax revenue in that context. So in general, therefore, the funds actually accruing to the revenue provision of public good will require this effect to be considered in that sense. So there are some interesting special cases in which the decentralized decision procedure describes about its optimum or optimal, and it would be the case, for example, if the demand for private good were independent of public good supply, so that tax revenue did not depend on the public good provisions at all. So this requirement is, however, too stringent basically, and have derived some further conditions under which decentralization is optimal. So decentralization of public good supply is considered of two tax regime. That is, the first is where taxes are set arbitrarily, so that one restrictions are placed on the way in which the revenue used to finance public provisions are raised. And in the second case, taxes is chosen optimally, that is, obey the Ramsay's rule. We have already discussed Ramsay's rule in the previous lecture, and we shall also contrast these two cases there. And the framework that we adopt here is, however, simply the stylized case, and we set aside the difficulties involved in pursuing consideration to reveal their preference between public good and in a truthful sense. And that is what is actually the whole model is. So let us look into the model. There are n private commodities, x to x1, x1 to xn, with a pre-tax price where corresponds with P1 to Pn, and post-tax prices of Q1 to Qn. And there is a single leisure good, that is L, of which the consumer has an endowment of T, and the pre and post-tax wage, that is, which is normalized to be equal to each other throughout the analysis, are denoted by W. All right, and there are M public goods, which is actually noted by Z1 to Zn within price to the planner, which is R1 to Rn. So we shall treat all producers' price as fixed, in which follows that is, fortunately none of our results depends upon doing so. So we consider that is the case of single consumer whose preferences are represented by direct utility function denoted by U, X, L and Z. U, X, L and Z. So, and an indirect utility function for public and private good defined by the equation, which is called V of Q, Z, W and W times T. So, which is nothing but maximization of an XL subject to U, X, L, Q of Q dash X plus WL, which is of course less than or equal to WT in that context. So the planner's problem is to maximize utility subject to tax revenue being sufficient to pay for the public good. Following, as we said, Stiglitz and Liu and Sheshinsky's paper, we can the paper of this basically consists of a case which is actually considered two different ways in which taxes could be set to meet the revenue requirement. The first is arbitrary taxation, by which they mean goods being taxed at any rate imaginably or unimaginable, and the second is an optimal taxes, where taxes are chosen to satisfy the Ramsay's rule, and that is what is actually their kind of finding in that. So they what they have actually found out is kind of a result which is interesting, and that result says that it is best to reformulate it in the manner suggested by a kind of a proposition which is put forth by Mireles, and the advantage of doing so is actually for them twofold. That is, the first order condition obtained from the reformulated problem are more convenient to deal with the second, and they are genuinely necessary condition for the optimization problem. So if that is the case, then their equation of the first one, that is the V is a function of QZ at WWT, is going to be turned as the cost function, that says C of QZW and U, which is nothing but the minimization of the Q dash X plus WL, such that UXLZ, which is equal to utility in that context. So what actually the whole proposition they are trying to make is the following, that in a nutshell, the whole finding of this paper tells us that that it is optimum to decentralize the supply of public good in the context of a very basic model. That is, we characterize, they characterize in fact the preference which permit this with either arbitrary or optimum tax, and the requirement in the later case is however less restrictive and exploit the optimality of the tax vector in a clearly interpretative way, and their result to complement with obtain uniform taxation given by different works, and generalize those obtained for present problem, which is also been generalization of Stiglitz model. So Stiglitz and others paper, which is actually we looked at. So most demand estimate for private good proceeds without including public good. This implicitly assumes that the separability restrictions, which is somewhat stronger than that required to the theorem, which is actually proposed as the first theorem. The theorem number 1 is actually nothing but their proposition, which is actually talks about the decentralization is optimal for arbitrary tax if and only if the consumer's utility function can be defined implicitly. And the second theorem of their inference is also very interesting. That is actually it is also followed from their proposition, and says that a decentralization is optimal in tax and sets optimally if and only if the consumer's utility function can be defined implicitly, which follows the f of the homogeneous degree case, which is discussed in the paper. So I am not going to the nitty-gritties of the paper. Why? Because I'm leaving that for your reference, and the paper is available. Both the paper are relevant paper, and the first and second theorem is actually been proved exists in the case, and notwithstanding their results do not constitute a further example in which the task setting optimum public policy is facilitated by the restriction. Now let's come back to actually our problem. So why we are actually talked about all this thing is because the theory of public good is a very important one, and the essentiality of the decentralized provision is also being discussed these days. Why? Earlier the public the clubs were being understood in a very centralized manner, or public would be not only the clubs, the public good per se had been seen in a centralized manner, which will be provided by a benevolent, centralized agency, which can be a central government or a subnational government or somebody like that. But later, there is a possibility of a decentralization, and there is a possibility of providing this in a decentralized fashion. For example, which in a subnational, in a sub regional, sub county or a district or a ward level, where you can actually have this sort of a facility, which may be actually chosen by the people, and they can actually pay and use it. In that sense, partly it is brought out by the principles of the privateness, which is essentially the kind of argument which economics interested in. In that sense, by bringing in the possibility of a public good, you are trying to basically modifies the nature, or you are trying to bring the whole idea of the non-excludable, non-rival risk case to excludable and rival in a pay use fashion in that sense. So now this is actually makes the whole idea of the club goods very appealing in front of all of us, and the decentralized provision gives a kind of a possibility of basically choose between different possible alternatives which are available. In that sense, it is also try to incorporate the economic logic in that sense. So a choice, an economic logic of choice, economic choice of its self-interest, economic choice of pay and use, etc. in that sense. So that is how the relevance of public good makes its sense, and now there is an enormous work on the public good provision under a club formulation, and that is being discussed. But there is a problem with it, and that is the provision of public, regarding the provision of public good, decentralization, and the impossibility of decentralization with that of the market failure will be discussed in a separate paper, though I have partly discussed this is with the Buchanan's perspective in a previous lecture, but I would like to basically reflect upon the same in a Musgravian, Samuelsonian, and other more general way of understanding this in a non what fashionable way in that sense. So I'll come to that problem in a while in a very different lecture altogether. So with this, let me stop the lecture and thank you for listening it. Thank you very much.